Soon after the end of the war, a dossier was found in the archives of the Munich Gestapo relating to the investigation into an underground organization in one of the concentration camps of Western Germany. The final document stated that the sentence passed on the members of the organization had been carried out and their bodies burnt in the crematorium. The first name on the list was Mostovskoy's. It was impossible to ascertain the name of the provocateur who had betrayed his comrades. Perhaps he was executed by the Gestapo together with the men he betrayed. The hostel belonging to the special unit assigned to the gas chambers, crematorium, and stores of poisonous substances were both warm and quiet. The prisoners who worked permanently in No. 1 complex enjoyed good living conditions. Beside each bed stood a small table with a carafe of boiled water. There was even a strip of carpet down the central passageway. The prisoners here were all trusties. They ate in a special building. The Germans in the special unit were able to choose their own menus as though in a restaurant. They were paid almost 3 times as much as officers and soldiers of corresponding rank on active service. Their families were granted rent reductions, maximum discounts on groceries, and the right to be the first evacuees from areas threatened by air raids. Private Rotzer's job was to watch through the inspection window. When the process was completed, he gave the order for the gas chamber to be emptied. He was also expected to check that the dentists worked efficiently and honestly. He had written several reports to the director of the complex, Sturmbannführer Kaltluft, about the difficulty of carrying out these 2 tasks at once. While Rotzer was up above watching the gassing, the workers down below were left unsupervised. The dentists and the men loading bodies onto the conveyor belt could steal and loot to their heart's content. Rotzer had grown accustomed to his work. Looking through the inspection window no longer disturbed or excited him as it had during the first few days. His predecessor had once been found engaged in a pastime more suitable for a 12-year-old boy than an SS soldier entrusted with a special assignment. At first, Rotzer hadn't understood why his comrades kept hinting at certain improprieties. Only later had he understood what they were talking about. Rotzer did not, however, enjoy his work. He was unnerved by the esteem that now surrounded him. The waitresses in the canteen kept asking why he was so pale. As far back as he could remember, Rotzer's mother had always been in tears, and time and again his father had been fired from work. He seemed to have been sacked from more jobs than he actually had. It was from his parents that Rotzer had learned his quiet, sidling walk, intended not to disturb anyone, and the anxious smile with which he greeted his neighbours, his landlord, his landlord's cat, the headmaster, and the policeman on the corner of the street. Gentleness and friendliness had seemed the fundamental traits of his character. Even he was surprised by how much hatred lay inside him, and how long he had kept it hidden. He had been seconded to the special unit. The commander, a man with a fine understanding of people, had at once sensed his gentle, effeminate nature. There was nothing pleasant about watching the convulsions of the Jews in the gas chambers. The soldiers who enjoyed working in the complex filled Rotzer with disgust. He especially disliked Zhuchenko, the prisoner of war on duty by the door of the gas chambers during the morning shift. He always had a childish and particularly unpleasant smile on his face. Rotzer didn't like his work, but he was well aware of the many official and unofficial perks it brought him. At the end of each day, one of the dentists would hand Rotzer a small packet containing several gold crowns. Although this represented only an insignificant fraction of the precious metal taken every day to the camp authorities, Rotzer had twice handed over almost 1 kilo of gold to his wife. This was their bright future, their dream of a peaceful old age. As a young man, Rotzer had been weak and timid, unable to play an active part in life's struggle. He had never doubted that the party had set itself one aim only: the well-being of the small and weak. He had already experienced the benefits of Hitler's policies. Life had improved immeasurably for him and his family. Sometimes, deep in his heart, Anton Khmelkov was appalled by his work. As he lay down in the evening and listened to Trofima Tuchenko's laughter, he'd be overcome by a cold, heavy fear. It was Tuchenko's job to close the hermetically sealed doors of the gas chamber. His large, strong hands and fingers always looked as though they hadn't been washed. Khmelkov didn't even like to take a piece of bread from the same basket as Tuchenko. Tuchenko looked happy and excited as he went out to work in the morning and waited for the column of prisoners from the railway line. But the slow progress of the column seemed to incense him. He'd twitch his jaws and make a thin, complaining sound in his throat, like a cat watching sparrows from behind a pane of glass. Khmelkov found Tuchenko very disturbing. Not that he himself was above having a few drinks and then going off for a bit of fun with one of the women in the queue. There was a little door through which members of the special unit could go into the changing room and pick out a woman. A man's a man, after all. Khmelkov would choose a woman or a girl, take her off to an empty corner, and half an hour later hand her back to the guard. Neither he nor the woman would say anything. Still, he wasn't in this job for the wine or the women, for gabardine riding breeches or boxscarf boots. Khmelkov had been taken prisoner in July 1941. He'd been beaten over the head and neck with a rifle butt. He'd suffered from dysentery. He'd been forced to march through the snow in tattered boots. He'd drunk yellow water tainted with fuel oil. He'd torn off hunks of black stinking meat from the carcass of a horse. He'd eaten potato peelings and rotten swedes. All he'd asked for, all he had wanted, was life itself. He had fought off dozens of deaths, from cold, from hunger, from bloody flux. He didn't want to fall to the ground with 9 grams of metal in his skull. He didn't want to swell up till his heart choked in the water rising from his legs. He wasn't a criminal, just a hairdresser from the town of Kerchi. No one, neither his relatives, his neighbours, his fellow workers, or the friends with whom he drank wine, ate smoked mullet, and played dominoes, had ever thought badly of him. There was a time when he thought he had nothing whatever in common with Tuchenko. Now, though, he sometimes thought that the differences between them were insignificant and trifling. What did it matter what the two of them felt? If the job they did was the same, what did it matter if one felt happy and the other felt sad? What Khmelkov didn't understand was that it wasn't Tuchenko's greater guilt that made him so disturbing. What was disturbing was that Tuchenko's behaviour could be explained by some terrible, innate depravity, whereas he himself was still a human being, and he was dimly aware that if you wish to remain a human being under fascism, there is an easier option than survival: death. The director of the complex, Sturmbannführer Kaltluft, had arranged for the controller's office to provide him each evening with a schedule of the next day's arrivals. He was able to inform his workers in advance of the number of wagons and the quantity of people expected. Depending on what country the train was from, the appropriate auxiliary units would be called up: barbers, escort guards, porters. Kaltluft disliked slovenliness of any kind. He never drank, and was furious if he found any of his subordinates the worse for drink. Only once had anyone seen him bright and animated. Sitting in his car, about to go and stay with his family over Easter, he'd beckoned to Sturmbannführer Hahn and showed him photographs of his daughter, a little girl with large eyes and a large face like her father's. Kaltluft enjoyed work and disliked wasting his time. He never went to the club after supper, he never played cards, and he never watched films. At Christmas, the special unit had had their own tree and arranged for a performance by an amateur choir. A free bottle of French cognac had been given out to every 2 men. Kaltluft had dropped in for half an hour, and everyone had seen the fresh ink stains on his fingers. He had been working on Christmas Eve. He had grown up in his parents' old home in the country. He wasn't afraid of hard work, and he enjoyed the peace of the village. It had seemed he would live there forever. He had dreamed of increasing the size of the holding, but no matter what he earned from his wheat, Swedes, and pigs, he had expected to stay on in the quiet, comfortable house. His life, however, had followed a different course. At the end of the First World War, he had been sent to the front. It seemed as though nothing less than fate itself had decreed his progression from the village to the army, from the trenches to HQ company, from clerk to adjutant, from the central apparatus of the RSHA to the administration of the camps, and finally to his appointment as commander of the Sonderkommando in an extermination camp. If, on the day of judgment, Kaltluft had been called upon to justify himself, he could have explained, quite truthfully, how fate had led him to become the executioner of 590,000 people. What else could he have done in the face of such powerful forces? The war, fervent nationalism, the adamancy of the party, the will of the state. How could he have swum against the current? He was a man, like any other. All he'd wanted was to live peacefully in his father's house. He hadn't walked, he'd been pushed. Fate had led him by the hand. And if they'd been called upon, Kaltluft's superiors and subordinates would have justified themselves in almost the same words. But Kaltluft was not asked to justify himself before a heavenly court, nor was God asked to reassure him that no one in the world is guilty. There is divine judgment. There is the judgment of a state, and the judgment of society, but there is one supreme judgment, the judgment of one sinner over another. A sinner can measure the power of the totalitarian state and find it limitless. Through propaganda, hunger, loneliness, infamy, obscurity, labour camps, and the threat of death, this terrible power can fetter a man's will. But every step that a man takes under the threat of poverty, hunger, labour camps, and death is at the same time an expression of his own will. Every step Kaltluft had taken, from the village to the trenches, from being a man in the street to being a member of the National Socialist Party, bore the imprint of his will. A man may be led by fate, but he can refuse to follow. He may be a mere tool in the hands of destructive powers, but he knows it is in his interest to assent to this. Fate and the individual may have different ends, but they share the same path. The man who pronounces judgment will be neither a pure and merciful heavenly being, nor a wise justice who watches over the interests of society and the state, neither a saint nor a righteous man, but a miserable, dirty sinner who has been crushed by fascism, who has himself experienced the terrible power of the state, who has himself bowed down, fallen, shrunk into timidity and submissiveness. And this judge will say, guilty. Yes, there are men in this terrible world who are guilty. It was the last day of the journey. There was a grinding of brakes and the wagon squealed to a halt. A moment of quiet was followed by the rattle of bolts and the order, "Alle Haus!" began to make their way out onto the platform. It was still wet from the recent rain. How strange people's faces seemed in the light. Their clothes had changed less than the people themselves. Coats, jackets, and shawls called to mind the houses where they had been put on, the mirrors in front of which they had been measured. The people emerging from the wagons clustered in groups. There was something familiar and reassuring in the closeness of the herd, in the smell and the warmth, in the exhausted eyes and faces, in the solidity of the vast crowd emerging from the 42 goods wagons. Two SS guards walked slowly up and down the platform, the nails of their boots ringing on the asphalt. They seemed haughty and thoughtful, looking neither at the young Jews carrying out the corpse of an old woman with streaks of white hair over her white face, nor at the curly-headed man on all fours drinking from a puddle, nor at the hunchbacked woman lifting up her skirt to adjust the torn elastic of her knickers. Now and again the SS guards glanced at each other and exchanged a few words. Their passage along the platform was like the sun's through the sky. The sun doesn't need to watch over the wind and clouds, to listen to the sound of leaves or of a storm at sea. It knows as it follows its smooth path that everything in the world depends on it. Men in caps with large peaks and blue overalls with white bands on the sleeves chivied on the new arrivals, shouting at them in a strange mixture of Russian, Yiddish, Polish, and Ukrainian. They organised the crowd quickly and efficiently. They weeded out people who could no longer stand up and got the stronger men to load the dying into vans. Then they moulded the milling throng into a column, inspired it with the idea of movement, and gave this movement direction and purpose. As they were formed up into ranks of 6, the news ran down the column. "The bathhouse! First we're going to the bathhouse!" No merciful God could have thought of anything kinder. "Very well, Jews, let's be off," shouted the man in the cape who commanded the unit responsible for unloading the train. The men and women were picking up their bags. The children were clinging to their mothers' skirts and the lapels of their fathers' jackets. The bathhouse! The bathhouse! The words were like a hypnotic charm that filled their consciousness. There was something attractive about the tall man in the cape. It was as if he were one of them, closer to their unhappy world than to the men in helmets and grey greatcoats. Carefully, entreatingly, an old woman stroked the sleeves of his overalls with the tips of her fingers, and asked, "Ihr sind a Jid? A Litvak, mein Kind?" "Da, da, Mamenka, ich bin ein Jid. Predko, panovia." Suddenly, in a hoarse, resonant voice, bringing together words used by the two opposing armies, he shouted, "Die Kolonna, marsch! Shogo, marsch!" The platform emptied. The men in overalls began sweeping up pieces of rag, scraps of bandages, a broken clog, and a child's brick that had been dropped on the ground. They slammed the doors of the wagons. A grinding wave ran down the train as it moved off to the disinfection point. After they had finished work, the unit returned to the camp through the service gates. The trains from the east were the worst. You got covered in lice. There was a foul stench from the corpses and invalids. No, they weren't like the wagons from Hungary, Holland, or Belgium, where you sometimes found a bottle of scent, a packet of cocoa, or a tin of condensed milk. A great city opened out before the travellers. Its western outskirts were lost in the mist. The dark smoke from the distant factory chimneys blended with the damp to form a low haze over the checkered pattern of the barrack huts. There was something surprising in the contrast between the mist and the angular geometry of the streets of barracks. To the northeast there was a dark red glow in the sky. It was as though the damp autumn sky had somehow become red hot. Sometimes a slow creeping flame escaped from this damp glow. The travellers emerged into a spacious square. In the middle of this square were several dozen people on a wooden bandstand, like in a public park. They were the members of a band, each of them as different from one another as their instruments. Some of them looked round at the approaching column. Then a grey-haired man in a colourful cloak called out, and they reached for their instruments. There was a burst of something like cheeky, timid bird-song, and the air that had been torn apart by the barbed wire and the howl of sirens that stank of oily fumes and garbage, was filled with music. It was like a warm summer cloudburst ignited by the sun, flashing as it crashed down to earth. People in camps, people in prisons, people who've escaped from prison, people going to their death, know the extraordinary power of music. No one else can experience music in quite the same way. What music resurrects in the soul of a man about to die is neither hope nor thought, but simply the blind, heart-breaking miracle of life itself. A sob passed down the column. Everything seemed transformed. Everything had come together. Everything scattered and fragmented. Home, peace, the journey, the rumble of wheels, thirst, terror, the city rising out of the mist, the wan red dawn, fused together, not into a memory or a picture, but into the blind, fierce ache of life itself. Here in the glow of the gas ovens, people knew that life was more than happiness. It was also grief. And freedom was both painful and difficult. It was life itself. Music had the power to express the last turmoil of a soul in whose blind depths every experience, every moment of joy and grief had fused with this misty morning, this glow hanging over their heads. Or perhaps it wasn't like that at all. Perhaps music was just the key to a man's feelings, not what filled him at this terrible moment, but the key that unlocked his innermost core. In the same way, a child's song can appear to make an old man cry, but it isn't the song itself he cries over. The song is simply a key to something in his soul. As the column slowly formed into a half circle round the square, a cream-coloured car drove through the camp gates. An SS officer in spectacles and a fur-collared greatcoat got out and made an impatient gesture, and the conductor, who had been watching him, let his hands fall with what seemed like a gesture of despair, and the music broke off. A number of voices shouted, "Halt!" The officer walked down the ranks. Sometimes he pointed at people, and the guard called them out. He looked them over casually while the guard asked in a quiet voice, so as not to disturb his thoughts, age, occupation. 30 people altogether were picked out. Then there was another command. "Doctors! Surgeons!" No one responded. "Doctors! Surgeons! Come forward!" Again, silence. The officer walked back to his car. He'd lost interest in the thousands of people in the square. The chosen were formed up into ranks of 5 and wheeled round towards the banner on the camp gates. Arbeit macht frei. A child in the main column screamed, and then some women. Their cries were wild and shrill. The chosen stood there in silence, hanging their heads. How can one convey the feelings of a man pressing his wife's hand for the last time? How can one describe that last quick look at a beloved face? And yes, how can a man live with the merciless memory of how, during the silence of parting, he blinked for a moment to hide the crude joy he felt at having to manage to save his life? How can he ever bury the memory of his wife's handing him a packet containing their wedding ring, a rusk, and some sugar lumps? How can he continue to exist, seeing the glow in the sky flaring up with renewed strength? Now the hands he had kissed must be burning. Now the eyes that had admired him. Now the hair whose smell he could recognize in the darkness. Now his children, his wife, his mother. How can he ask for a place in the barracks nearer the stove? How can he hold out his bowl for a litre of grey swill? How can he repair the torn sole of his boot? How can he wield a crowbar? How can he drink? How can he breathe? With the screams of his mother and children in his ears. Those who were to remain alive were taken towards the camp gates. They could hear the other people shouting, and they were shouting themselves, tearing at their shirts on their breasts as they walked towards their new life. Electric fences, reinforced concrete towers with machine guns, barrack huts, pale-faced women and girls looking at them from behind the wire, columns of people marching to work with scraps of red, yellow and blue sewn to their chests. Once again the orchestra struck up. The people chosen to work entered the town built on the marshes. Dark water forced its way sullenly and mutely between heavy blocks of stone and slabs of concrete. It was a rusty black, and it smelt of decay. It was covered in green chemical foam, filthy shreds of rag, blood-stained clothes, discarded by the camp operating theatres. It disappeared underground, came back to the surface, disappeared once more. Nevertheless, it forced its way through. The waves of the sea and the morning dew were still present, still alive in the dark water of the camp. Meanwhile, the condemned went to their death. Sophia Levington was walking with heavy, even steps. The little boy beside her was holding her hand. His other hand was in his pocket, clutching a matchbox containing a dark brown chrysalis wrapped in cotton wool that had just emerged from the cocoon. The machinist, Lazar Yankovich, walked beside them. His wife, Deborah Samuelovna, was carrying a child in her arms. Behind him, Rebecca Bockman was muttering, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The fifth person in the row was the librarian, Musia Borisovna. She had put up her hair, and the nape of her neck seemed quite white. Several times during the journey she had exchanged her ration of bread for half a mess tin of warm water. She never grudged anyone anything. In the wagon she had been looked on as a saint. The old women, good judges of character, used to kiss her dress. The rank in front consisted of only 4 people. During the selection, the officer had called out 2 men from this rank straight away, a father and son, the Slepoys. In response to the question about profession, they had shouted, "Zahnarzt!" The officer had nodded. The Slepoys had guessed right. They had one life. 3 of the men left in the rank walked with their arms dangling by their sides. It was as though they no longer needed them. The 4th walked with a carefree gait, the collar of his jacket turned up, his hands in his pockets, his head thrown back. 4 or 5 ranks in front was a huge man in a soldier's winter cap. Just behind Sophia Levington was Musia Vinokur, who had celebrated her 14th birthday in the goods wagon. Death. It had become sociable, quite at home. It called on people without ceremony, coming into their yards and workshops, meeting a housewife at the market, and taking her off, together with her sack of potatoes, joining in children's games, peeping into a shop where some tailors were hurrying to finish a coat for the wife of a commissar, waiting in a bread queue, sitting down beside an old woman darning stockings. Death carried on in its own everyday manner, and people in theirs. Sometimes it allowed them to finish a cigarette or eat up a meal. Sometimes it came up on a man with comradely bluffness, slapping him on the back and guffawing stupidly, as though people had now understood death, as though it had at last revealed how humdrum it was, how childishly simple. Really, it was an easy crossing, just a shallow stream with planks thrown across from one bank, where there was smoke coming out of the wooden huts, to the other bank, and its empty meadows. It was a mere 5 or 6 steps, that was all. What was there to be afraid of? A calf was just going over the bridge. You could hear its hooves, and there were some little boys running across in bare feet. Sophia Levington listened to the music. She had first heard this piece when she was a child. She had listened to it again as a student, and then as a young doctor. It always filled her with a keen sense of the future. But this time the music was deceptive. Sophia Levington had no future, only a past. For a moment this sense of her past blotted out everything present, blotted out the abyss. It was the very strangest of feelings, something you could never share with any other person, not even your wife, your mother, your brother, your son, your friend, or your father. It was the secret of your soul. However passionately it might long to, your soul could never betray this secret. You carry away this sense of your life without having ever shared it with anyone. The miracle of a particular individual whose conscious and unconscious contain everything good and bad, everything funny, sweet, shameful, pitiful, timid, tender, uncertain, that has happened from childhood to old age, fused into the mysterious sense of an individual life. When the music began, David had wanted to take the matchbox out of his pocket, open it just for a moment, so the chrysalis wouldn't catch cold, and let it see the musicians, but after a few steps, he forgot the people on the bandstand. There was nothing left but the music and the glow in the sky. The sad, powerful melody filled his soul with longing for his mother, a mother who was neither strong nor calm, a mother who was ashamed at having been deserted by her husband. She had made David a calico shirt, and the people in the other rooms along the corridor had laughed at him because it had flowers on it, and the sleeves weren't straight. She had been everything to him. He had always relied on her without thinking. But now, perhaps because of the music, he no longer relied on her. He loved her, but she was weak and helpless, just like the people walking beside him now, and the music was quiet and sleepy. It was like the little waves he had seen when he had had a fever, when he had crawled off his burning pillow into warm, damp sand. The band howled. It was as though some huge dried-up throat had started to wail. The dark wall, the wall that had risen up out of the water when he was ill, was hanging over him now, filling the whole sky. Everything that had ever terrified his little heart now became one. The fear aroused by the picture of a little goat who hadn't noticed the shadow of a wolf between the trunks of the fir trees. The blue eyes of the dead calves at the market, his dead grandmother, Rebecca Bookman's suffocated daughter, his first unreasoning terror at night that had made him scream out desperately for his mother. Death was standing there, as huge as the sky, watching while little David walked towards him on his little legs. All around him there was nothing but music, and he couldn't cling to it or even batter his head against it. As for the cocoon, it had no wings, no paws, no antennae, no eyes. It just lay there, in its little box, stupidly trustful, waiting. David was a Jew. He was choking and hiccuping. He would have strangled himself if he'd been able to. The music stopped. His little feet and dozens of other little feet were hurrying along. He had no thoughts, and he was unable to weep or scream. His fingers were wet with sweat. They were squeezing a little box in his pocket. He no longer even remembered what it was. There was nothing except his little feet, walking, hurrying, running. If the horror that gripped him had lasted only a few more minutes, he'd have fallen to the ground, his heart broken. When the music stopped, Sophia Levington wiped away her tears and said angrily, "Yes, it's just what that poor man said." And then she glanced at the boy's face. Even here, in its peculiar expression, made it stand out. "What is it? What's the matter with you?" she shouted, gripping his hand. "What is it? What's the matter? We're just going to the bathhouse to wash." When they'd called for the doctors and surgeons, she had remained silent, fighting against some powerful force that she found repugnant. The machinist's wife was walking along beside her. In her arms, the pathetic little baby, his head too large for its body, was looking around with a calm, thoughtful expression. It was this woman, Deborah, who one night in the goods wagon had stolen a handful of sugar for her baby. The injured party had been too feeble to do anything, but old Lapidus had stood up for her. No one had wanted to sit near him. He was always urinating on the floor. And now Deborah was walking along beside her, holding her baby in her arms. The baby, who had cried day and night, was quite silent. The woman's sad dark eyes stopped one from noticing the hideousness of her dirty face and pale crumpled lips. A Madonna, thought Sophia Levington. Once, about 2 years before the war, she had watched the sun as it rose behind the pine trees on Tian Shan, catching the white squirrels in its light. The lake lay there in the dawn as though it had been chiselled out of some pure blue condensed to the solidity of stone. She had thought then that there was probably no one in the world who wouldn't envy her. And at the same moment, with an intensity that burnt her 50-year-old heart, she had felt ready to give up everything. If only in some shabby, dark, low-ceilinged room she could be hugged by the arms of a child. She had always loved children, but little David evoked some special tenderness in her that she had never felt before. In the goods wagon she had given him some bread, and he had turned his little face towards her in the half-light. She had wanted to weep, to hug him, to smother him with kisses like a mother kissing her child. In a whisper that no one else could hear, she had said, "Eat, my son, eat." She seldom spoke to the boy. Some strange shame made her want to hide the maternal feelings welling up inside her, but she had noticed that he always watched anxiously if she moved to the other side of the wagon, and that he calmed down when she was near him. She didn't want to admit why she hadn't answered when they'd called for doctors and surgeons, why she'd been seized at that moment by a feeling of exaltation. The column moved on beside the barbed wire and the ditches, past the reinforced concrete towers with their machine guns. To these people who no longer remembered freedom, it seemed that the barbed wire and the machine guns were there not to stop the inmates from escaping, but to stop the condemned from hiding away in the camp. The path turned away from the barbed wire and led towards some low, squat buildings with flat roofs. From a distance, these rectangles with grey, windowless walls looked like the children's bricks David had once glued together to make pictures. As the column turned, a gap appeared in the ranks, and David saw that some of the buildings had their doors flung wide open. Not knowing why, he took the little box out of his pocket and, without saying anything to the chrysalis, flung it away. "Let it live." "Splendid people, these Germans," said the man in front, as though the guards might hear and appreciate his flattery. The man with the raised collar shrugged his shoulders in a manner that was somehow peculiar, gave a quick glance to either side of him, and seemed to grow taller and more imposing. With a sudden, nimble jump, as though he had spread his wings, he punched an SS guard in the face and knocked him to the ground. Sophia Levington leapt after him with an angry shout. She stumbled and fell. Several hands grabbed her and helped her up. The people behind were pressing on. David glanced round, afraid of being knocked over, and caught a glimpse of the man being dragged away by the guards. In the brief instant when Sophia had attempted to attack the guard, she had forgotten about David. Now once more she took him by the hand. David saw how clear, fierce, and splendid human eyes can be when, even for a fraction of a second, they sense freedom. By now the front ranks had already reached the asphalt square in front of the bathhouse. Their steps sounded different as they marched through the wide open doors.